Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Nobody's joining me on the podcast today. It's just me. So before we get into it, if you want to learn more about our wealth management services, about our research and consulting services, if you just want to talk to me directly, my email address is jacob@cognitive.investments. Please feel free to reach out. A lot of you have in the last couple of weeks, and it's always interesting to learn from you. Because of the holiday week, I didn't have a guest lined up, and then Rob had to go visit the prefect of police in Paris. I feel like I'm in the movie Casablanca right now to deal with his long-term residency visa. So all you have are the sweet, dulcet tones of this voice today. I'm not going to take up too much of your time, but I do think it is worth discussing briefly the main geopolitical development of the week, which was China announcing on Monday that it was going not exactly to restrict exports, but to introduce export controls on gallium and germanium effective August 1st. Now, these are not export bans. Chinese companies will have to go to the Chinese government for approval to export these critical metals going forward. So the Chinese government is inserting itself here, and it can approve or not approve those exports as it sees fit. But again, increasing Chinese government control over the exports of these minerals, which are important for semiconductors, for 5G technology, for a lot of different things, and which has a lot of U.S., especially tech companies, on edge. I think the reporting on this has been a little bit backwards, though. So you have to go back to the previous week when the Wall Street Journal reported that the United States was considering new restrictions on exports of artificial intelligence chips to China, and also on banning the lease of cloud services to Chinese AI companies. That was early in the week, and again, that's a Wall Street Journal report, but it seems pretty clear that that's the direction that the United States is going in. Then on Friday, the Dutch government announced new export controls of its own on advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment exports. Now, ASML, which is this main Dutch company that exports this complicated technology, they had already introduced these controls for extreme ultraviolet lithography equipment, but now it's also going to apply to deep ultraviolet lithography equipment. And as I'm reading my notes here, I see that I have a typo. I said ultraviolet lithography equipment. That's interesting. I should make sure that my notes are edited in the future. But in any case, the Dutch government announcement is actually sort of form for form exactly what the Chinese government said. They said that they were going to introduce these controls on September 1st. So China came back and said, all right, gallium and germanium are up for our export controls, and we are going to review them starting on August 1st. Now, gallium and germanium are not particularly rare. Neither are rare earth elements, and neither are a lot of the different mineral commodities that China has a dominant position in the global economy for refining and mining. I had to get up to speed fairly quickly on these. I didn't know this obviously coming in, but they are often mined as byproducts of zinc and bauxite. Bauxite is the ore necessary for producing aluminum, and I hope that we'll be able to have Tomas on here in the next couple of weeks to talk about this. The key, though, is that these mineral commodities are not rare. The reason China has assumed a dominant position is because China is willing to mine and refine and process them more cheaply anywhere else in the world. And one of the reasons China is willing to do this is because it's very, very pollutive and bad for the environment to mine these things at a cheap level. So China basically, and this is true in a lot of different industries, it just drove out all the competition. It was willing to do it more cheaply than anybody else was willing to do it in the world. And so China was able to ascend to a real position of leverage when it comes to mineral commodities in the global supply chain. Now, and I should also add, the U.S. depends on China for more than 50% of its gallium and its germanium imports, despite Trump-era tariffs on these mineral commodities from 2018. So the United States government under both Trump and Biden has been trying to increase U.S. self-sufficiency when it comes to these mineral commodities, but not even tariffs have been able to level the field enough. Now, China, let me take a step back. Both the United States and China are losers in this situation, but China is the bigger loser. And let me tell you why. It goes back to the fact that gallium and germanium and all of these different elements, they are not rare. It's not like China has the element and nobody else in the world has the element. It's that Chinese economic and government policy was willing to mine and process them in those places. So there's actually a mine in the United States, in the state of Utah. It hasn't been operational since the mid-1980s, that used to mine germanium and gallium. It's owned by Tech Resources. You can go look it up. It's somewhere in Utah. But again, China is the one that has ascended to this position, and it has this leverage over these mineral commodities in general. The point being, though, for US mining companies or for Western mining companies, this is actually great news because now they can go and mine some of these commodities that they just couldn't compete with in China in general. The same is not true for China. China cannot go to the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, or Namibia, or Indonesia, and mine GPUs for artificial intelligence there. It can't find EUV and DUV lithography equipment from Argentina or from favorable concessions with other African countries or debt trap diplomacy or all the things that people say China employs. The thing about this type of leverage is that it is strongest when it is used as a threat, not when it's actually implemented. And we can see this going back to when China tried to use rare earth elements as a cudgel against Japan as far back as 2010 and 2011. Now, I say it's a lose-lose situation because if you're a semiconductor company, or if you're a 5G company or a telecoms company, well, the cost of these mineral commodities just went up. You're probably going to have to rethink your supply chains in general, and you're going to have a market where things are not going to be as cheap as they used to be. But if you're these mining companies, these processing companies, logistics companies, you can imagine that the market itself is going to reorient itself and there will be winners and there will be losers here. But one of the reasons the semiconductor supply chain is so important, aside from the fact that it is at the core of Internet of Things and artificial intelligence and automation and all these things that are supposed to increase worker productivity and create a new tech revolution in the 2020s, is that really semiconductors are the platonic ideal of a globalized supply chain. Different countries have their own specific expertise. So Taiwan is where the fabs are, and Japan has the photoresist, and South Korea does memory, and the Dutch have the EUV equipment. The United States does the design. It's an incredibly diverse, decentralized supply chain, and all these semiconductors that drive down the cost of our iPhones, that we can use them whenever we want and have them be relatively cheap, is because of those economies of scale, because of free trade, because of all the things that go with globalization. That's obviously going away. And semiconductors is the key place where it's happening because it's the center of tech. It's the most globalized supply chain that's out there. And you have all these different countries that are racing to have this tech self-sufficiency. Now, the flip side is still true here for the United States. The leverage that it had with basically preventing China from having these technologies was strongest as a threat. Once the US decides to employ these different threats and starts really cutting US tech companies off from the Chinese ecosystem, well, the Chinese have nothing to lose. And yes, maybe their economy and maybe their grand plans will be set back for a couple of years. But the only way you think that this is effective in the long term is if you think that China fundamentally cannot replicate any of these technologies. And you've probably heard me say this on the podcast before. I'm not going to underestimate China. Analysts have been underestimating China since 1951. And if you just look at the simple geopolitics on paper, there's no reason that the People's Republic of China should still be around. But it is. And they've done remarkable things over their history. And the idea that, not being able to come up with a domestic semiconductor industry, that's going to be the thing that foils them, I just don't buy it. Now, maybe it will take them 5 years. Maybe it'll take them 10 years. Maybe you'll see lower economic growth rates. Yes, I accept all that. It could be very, very painful. But I don't think it's going to lead to the demise of the Chinese Communist Party or China in general. And that's my real question here. What is the goal of the United States in doing this? Yes, you can cut China off from critical technology that allows it to meet some of its goals with artificial intelligence or automation or tech sovereignty here out to 2025. But does the United States actually think that it can have, Blinken over in China and Janet Yellen's supposed to be there this week, and then you're going to have, that's the carrot, and the stick is the semiconductor export controls, and that you're just going to bring China to heel? I think the main problem for the U.S. foreign policy establishment going back decades now is that the U.S. government expects that it can do something and it will change Chinese behavior. You can let China into the WTO and it will become a bastion of free trade. You can sanction China for Tiananmen or for what's going on in Xinjiang, and that will encourage them not to engage in human rights abuses or whatever else you don't like. Time and time again, China has shown the world that it's not going to do things just because you tell it to. China's going to operate on its own. So either you have to deal with China on a pragmatic basis and find some accommodation or some room for primary interest and deal with the fact that there are some things you're going to disagree with, and the United States does this with many countries, or you basically have to say, no, China is a peer competitor, it's an enemy, it's a threat to the United States in the long run, and we have to do everything we can to separate ourselves from this market. And if the United States is going to do that, again, the United States has more leverage. It has more of the tech. It has more of the things you need to succeed in this. But in the long run, if the United States is going to be the author of reversing globalization, it's actually going to create the bad actor that it says it's trying to combat in the first place. Now, again, go back to the debate I had with Emily de la Bruyere on this podcast itself. Maybe that's the direction China's headed in anyway. And China has done some things that I find personally disturbing, especially in Xinjiang. A Chinese analyst could sit here and say the same thing about the United States. There are plenty of disturbing things that the United States government has done to minority communities in this country for a long time. I'm not really interested in the he said, she said, who's worse. That comparative moralism doesn't actually do anything for me. All I'm saying is that you have the United States and China, which are the two leaders of the global economy, who have really been, they've been the rising tide that lifted all boats with their economic relationship really starting in the 70s, accelerating in the 80s and 90s. And for whatever reason, they're both basically saying, well, we can't come to any kind of accommodation. And we're going to speak to each other. We're going to have meetings. The form of everything is going to be fine. But when it comes down to advancing the global economy, if we're working together on economic growth and prosperity, our differences and the gulf is just too high. So it doesn't matter what industry you're in. Most industries in the United States are exposed to China and to the Chinese market somehow. I often speak to agriculture audiences, but you'd be hard-pressed to find an audience or an industry that is not affected by the US-China relationship. But what's happening with semiconductors right now, it's probably going to happen to trade in general with the US and China. And it's going to go industry by industry, and things will be true until they're not. But you should really be paying attention to what the United States and China are doing right now, because both sides are basically saying these notions of sovereignty and of security and geopolitics and volatility are more important than doing business, are more important than global economic growth, are more important than working together on things like the pandemic. That has its advantages and disadvantages. I'm not here to tell you what's right and what's wrong, but that is happening, and this is a really great example of it happening in real time. Before I let you go, listeners, I just want to say I just wrapped up a big project on natural gas. It is getting published as an In Focus piece on the Knowledge platform next week. If you want access to the Knowledge platform, there's a subscriber fee for that. You can find that on cognitive.investments. The teaser of that is that we are bullish here on natural gas at Cognitive Investments. You might remember that last September we were bearish. We were saying this European energy crisis, it's really an imaginary crisis. We don't think it's going to be that big of a deal. Now we are in the awkward position of having gotten at the other end. The European energy crisis was, as we predicted, an imaginary crisis. And now we're saying we think it's a little overdone. It looks like natural gas is undervalued and people are too sanguine, whereas last summer and last fall, they were a little bit too worried. Now, it's a much more complicated argument because last fall, I could literally just point to supply and demand and say, hey, there's enough natural gas out there. There's enough LNG available for Europe to import. Yes, it will be difficult to find the new sources, but in general, Europe is going to be able to find the gas that it needs. It's not that elegant or simple an argument here. We have to go into some depth to explain why we think that natural gas prices could go up from here and some of the pitfalls and scenarios that could prove us wrong. But if that is the sort of thing that is interesting to you, if that is interesting to you from your own investment portfolio or if you're listening to this for a professional reason from your job, please reach out to me. Happy to share that report with you. If not, hey, a lot of the tips of these icebergs get either sprinkled into this podcast or into the Global Situation Report, and that stuff is and will remain free as long as I have anything to do with it, which I hope is for a very long time. So, short 16-minute podcast. Hopefully that covers most of your morning commutes if you're listening in to me here about that. We will pick it up. Sim is lined up for a Ukraine counteroffensive check-in early next week. We've got a couple other guests that are coming back on, and we will get the cadence rolling again. Rob, I hope that your appointment with the prefect of police went well. And listeners, cheers and see you out there. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.